On 22 December 2024, the guided missile cruiser USS Gettysburg, CG-64, mistakenly engaged two U.S. Navy F/A-18F Super Hornets over the Red Sea, shooting one down and narrowly missing the second, in what Navy investigators now describe as a preventable friendly fire disaster rooted in training, communication, and leadership failures across the entire Harry S. Truman carrier strike group. Both crew members of the downed Super Hornet ejected and were recovered alive, with no fatalities but with one minor injury. Yet the final investigation makes clear that the strike group came within seconds and just a few dozen meters of losing a second jet and two more aviators to its own missiles. The day Gettysburg shot down its own jet. On a tense December night in 2024, the USS Harry S. Truman carrier strike group was on station in the Red Sea, part of a high-tempo combat deployment against Iran-backed Houthi forces targeting commercial shipping and coalition vessels with drones and missiles. The atmosphere across the group was a mix of routine and razor-edge alertness. Crews were exhausted from months of operations, yet the threat of another incoming salvo kept every radar operator and watchstander on edge. Within that force, the Ticonderoga-class cruiser USS Gettysburg served as one of the group's primary air defense platforms, bristling with Aegis radar and standard surface-to-air missiles, responsible for detecting and killing hostile threats before they could hit the carrier or its escorts. In the air above, F/A-18F Super Hornets from the Truman Air Wing flew combat sorties and tanker missions, including the buddy refueling flights that quietly kept the air campaign going hour after hour. The operational backdrop. By late 2024, the Red Sea had become one of the most dangerous pieces of airspace on the planet, with Houthi forces in Yemen launching anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and one-way attack drones on a regular basis. U.S. and Allied warships routinely fired interceptors, often on very short timelines, to protect not only themselves, but also merchant vessels transiting one of the world's most critical maritime chokepoints. This constant threat warped the daily rhythm of the strike group, compressing decision-making cycles and reinforcing a mindset that anything popping up on radar with the wrong profile could become lethal within seconds. Investigators later concluded that this environment of genuine danger, layered over gaps in training and cohesion, set the stage for what happened that night between Gettysburg and the Super Hornets. The Super Hornet mission. On 22 December, a two-seat F/A-18F from Strike Fighter Squadron 11, the Red Rippers, launched from the deck of USS Harry S. Truman for a mission that combined routine and risk in equal measure. The jet, configured in its buddy tanker role, was supporting other aircraft with in-flight refueling while also remaining part of the broader combat air patrol and strike support framework that the carrier maintained over the Red Sea battlespace. Alongside it, at least one other Super Hornet operated in the same area, flying a coordinated profile that, in theory, should have been fully integrated into the strike group's air defense picture through radar tracks, identification systems, and shared communications networks. The Navy's final summaries and media analyses emphasize that there was nothing inherently unusual about the jet's flight that night. The problem lay in how that flight was perceived and processed on board Gettysburg and across the formation. The threat picture on Gettysburg. Inside Gettysburg's Combat Information Center, sailors manned consoles tied into the Aegis combat system, sifting through radar returns, data links, and identification tracks in an environment where hostile threats from Yemen had become a grimly familiar part of the watch. Standard operating procedures called for rapid detection, classification, and engagement decisions against any object assessed as a credible incoming missile, especially ballistic or cruise missiles believed to be targeting the strike group. The investigation later found that in the days and weeks before the incident, the crew had been operating under intense pressure with incomplete, fragmented opportunities for realistic integrated training with the rest of the carrier strike group. That lack of integrated rehearsal meant that, in the heat of the moment, teams aboard Gettysburg were far less practiced at matching what their systems showed with what friendly aircraft were actually doing above them. Misidentification in a crowded sky. When the F/A-18F Super Hornets entered the part of the airspace that intersected Gettysburg's defensive arcs, the cruiser's systems and watch teams began to interpret the radar track through the lens of an incoming threat. The Navy's command investigation concluded that the aircraft were misidentified as hostile missiles, a catastrophic classification error that should have been caught and corrected through redundant checks, challenge and reply procedures, and forceful backup from other watchstanders and units. At the core of the failure, the investigation cites a lack of integrated training opportunities between USS Gettysburg and the carrier strike group, lack of forceful backup on the cruiser, and lack of cohesion across the carrier strike group, all of which combine to allow a friendly Super Hornet to be mistaken for a hostile inbound weapon. In simpler terms, the people, the processes, and the network that should have shouted, "Those are our jets," stayed quiet or spoke too softly, while the system marched forward toward a firing decision. The decision to fire. In those critical minutes, the tactical picture inside Gettysburg narrowed until the misidentified track appeared to many in combat as an imminent, hostile threat that had to be killed before it reached a high-value unit. The commanding officer, ultimately responsible for any weapons released from the ship, was presented with assessments and recommendations shaped by that flawed identification and the intense operational context of the Houthi missile campaign. Investigators later judged that the decision to fire was neither reasonable nor prudent, a damning assessment that placed significant blame on the Gettysburg's commander for failing to demand sufficient confirmation and challenged the unfolding misidentification before authorizing missile launch. Nonetheless, in that moment, the order was given, and Standard Missile 2 surface-to-air weapons leapt from the cruiser toward what the ship believed were enemy missiles, but which were, in reality, U.S. Navy F/A-18. Impact on the first Super Hornet. One of those SM-2 missiles found its mark on the first F/A-18F, turning an American fighter into a ball of fire over the Red Sea in a flash that must have shocked not only the aviators in the jet, but everyone watching the track from ships and stations across the formation. The jet was destroyed, but both the pilot and the weapons systems officer managed to eject, their survival a testament to ejection seat engineering, training, and perhaps sheer luck under the worst possible circumstances. U.S. Central Command and subsequent Navy releases confirmed that the 2 crew members were recovered from the water, with one sustaining only minor injuries after initial medical assessment. For the air wing and the squadron, the relief of getting their people back alive collided with the grim realization that the loss had not come from enemy fire, mechanical failure, or bad weather, but from a missile launched by their own side. The near kill of the second jet. The investigation and follow-on reporting reveal that the disaster very nearly became even worse. Gettysburg fired at a second F/A-18F, and the SM-2 missile missed that jet by roughly 100 feet, a margin that, at supersonic closing speeds, amounted to a fraction of a second and a sliver of space between survival and another fireball. The second Super Hornet's crew executed aggressive evasive maneuvers, jinking and maneuvering to defeat the missile's intercept geometry, actions that investigators credit with helping prevent a second friendly loss. At one point, Gettysburg even targeted a third friendly aircraft, locking onto it within the system's engagement chain, though the ship stopped short of actually launching against that target. Those details, laid out in released documents and press investigations, underscore how the friendly fire chain of events was not a single, isolated trigger pull, but a pattern of cascading misjudgments that was barely halted before claiming even more U.S. aircraft and aircrew. Immediate aftermath and recovery. In the minutes after the shootdown, the strike group shifted rapidly into search and rescue mode, launching assets to retrieve the downed aviators while also trying to untangle what had just happened in the air picture. Helicopters, likely MH-60s from the carrier air wing or embarked detachments, closed on the splash points and coordinated with surface ships to bring the crew back aboard, ending the immediate life or death phase of the incident. Meanwhile, on Gettysburg and across the Truman strike group, shock mingled with confusion and denial as watchstanders realized the hostile missile track was one of their own Super Hornets. Radio circuits that, moments before, had been focused on threat calls and engagement orders now echoed with urgent demands for confirmation, battle damage assessment, and initial reporting of a friendly fire catastrophe in one of the world's most scrutinized maritime theaters. Launch of formal investigations. Given the magnitude of the event, a U.S. Navy warship shooting down an American jet and nearly destroying another, formal investigations began almost immediately, both within the Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group and at higher echelons of Navy leadership. The friendly fire shoot-down joined three other major mishaps from Truman's troubled deployment, including the loss of additional F/A-18 and a collision with a merchant ship, in a cluster of incidents that demanded detailed scrutiny. The Navy's consolidated investigation and publicly released summaries framed the Gettysburg episode not as an isolated freak accident, but as part of a pattern driven by leadership failures, malfunctioning or poorly maintained equipment in some cases, training shortfalls, and a breakdown of basic safeguards across the strike group. In the case of the friendly fire incident specifically, the focus narrowed to why existing identification procedures, cross-checks, and command judgment had all failed in sequence aboard a frontline Aegis cruiser. Key findings on root causes. The official Navy communication on the incident states that the investigation found that a lack of integrated training opportunities between USS Gettysburg and the Carrier Strike Group, lack of forceful backup on the cruiser, and lack of cohesion across the Carrier Strike Group contributed to the misidentification and subsequent engagement of the friendly aircraft and near miss of another. Crucially, the report also emphasizes that there were no mechanical failures driving the misidentification. The systems were functioning within expected parameters, which meant that the breakdown was fundamentally about human performance, command climate, and procedural execution. Media outlets that obtained additional documents highlighted that the decision to fire, taken by Gettysburg's commanding officer, did not meet the standard of a reasonable or prudent engagement given the available information, even in the context of real missile threats from Yemen. This language signaled that the Navy saw the event not merely as a tragic consequence of fog of war ambiguity, but as a serious lapse in judgment compounded by a weak culture of challenge and backup within the ship's watch teams. Failures in identification and backup. Proper identification of air tracks in a modern carrier strike group depends on multiple layers. Radar signatures, transponder and IFF data, shared tactical data links, pre-planned air tasking orders, and voice communications that can confirm who is where, doing what. The Gettysburg incident revealed that these layers were not working together as robustly as they should have been. The misidentification of the Super Hornets as hostile missiles moved through the system without being stopped by a decisive "this doesn't make sense" from any of the checks designed to prevent fratricide. Investigators called out specifically the lack of forceful backup on the cruiser, meaning that subordinates and fellow watchtenders either did not strongly challenge the emerging decision to engage or were not empowered, culturally or procedurally, to halt the engagement based on their doubts. That absence of assertive cross-checking turned what should have been a reversible classification error into an irreversible weapons release, pushing the friendly fire chain all the way to impact. Strike group cohesion and training. Beyond the lifelines of Gettysburg itself, the investigation pointed to a broader problem of weak cohesion across the Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group, noting that the cruiser and the air wing had not received enough integrated training together to build a shared mental model of how operations, communications, and identification would work under real combat pressure. This gap meant that, when the crisis arrived in the form of the misidentified tracks, the units did not instinctively fall into well-rehearsed patterns of cross-talk and mutual verification that might have saved the Super Hornet. The Truman deployment had already been marked by high operational tempo and a series of mishaps, including the loss of other F/A-18 through mechanical failures and mishandled deck operations, which the Navy also linked to shortfalls in manning, maintenance, and training. The friendly fire incident became the most politically and symbolically explosive of these, but in the investigation's narrative it was part of the same underlying story, a force stretched thin, trying to fight hard with cracks in its foundation. Accountability and command consequences. In the months following the shoot-down, the Navy took administrative and career actions against multiple leaders connected to the Truman Strike Group's mishaps, including the commander of USS Gettysburg. Reports indicate that the Gettysburg Co. turned over command in early 2025, with the friendly fire investigation and its harsh assessment of the firing decision contributing significantly to that change of leadership. While public releases often avoid granular details of every disciplinary measure, the combination of investigation language and subsequent command changes sends a clear message. The Navy viewed the Gettysburg event as a preventable failure of leadership and process, not a mere unavoidable tragedy of modern warfare. In parallel, the service sought to demonstrate to both internal audiences and external observers that such a mistake, shooting down one's own jet, would have real consequences at the command level. Human impact on aircrew and sailors. Behind the procedural language and command decisions, the incident left a deep mark on the people directly involved. The aviators who saw their jet destroyed by a friendly missile, the air wing personnel who watched one of their aircraft vanish from the radar, and the sailors on Gettysburg whose consoles and orders contributed to the shootdown. For the two Super Hornet crew members, survival was only the beginning. They faced the psychological weight of knowing that their near-death experience came not from enemy fire, but from a ship sailing under the same flag and reporting to the same chain of command. On Gettysburg, watchtenders and officers had to live with the knowledge that their actions and inactions, interpreting tracks, recommending engagement, authorizing launch, culminated in fratricide in a theater already filled with genuine enemy threats. The investigation highlights process and training, but the human reality is that individuals had to process guilt, anger, and doubt, even as they remained deployed in a war zone where the next genuine missile could appear at any time. Public narrative and information war. Almost immediately after the shootdown, Yemeni Houthi forces and their allied media outlets claimed credit, asserting that they had downed an American jet with their own weapons, propaganda designed to portray the group as capable of striking U.S. air power directly. In contrast, U.S. Central Command publicly acknowledged that the fighter had been mistakenly fired on by USS Gettysburg, an unusual level of transparency driven both by the facts of the incident and the high likelihood that fragments of truth and rumor would circulate regardless. This information clash created a strange dual narrative, one side claiming a victorious engagement against a U.S. jet, the other admitting to a deeply embarrassing friendly fire event in the midst of a sensitive maritime campaign. For military professionals and analysts, the Navy's decision to release significant detail in the following months, including formal investigation summaries, became a rare and valuable window into how a modern air defense network can fail under pressure. Lessons drawn by the Navy. In its public statements, the Navy stressed that the Gettysburg incident had driven new emphasis on integrated training between cruisers, destroyers, and carrier air wings, particularly in complex environments like the Red Sea where threats are real and timelines compressed. The service indicated that it would refine doctrine, simulation, and live fire rehearsals to ensure that ships and aircraft could better synchronize identification and engagement decisions, reducing the risk of another friendly fire catastrophe. The broader investigation into Truman's troubled deployment also pointed to systemic issues, manning, maintenance, and the strain of prolonged high-tempo operations that demanded attention if the Navy wanted to sustain credible combat performance without eroding safety margins to dangerous levels. By tying the friendly fire shootdown to these larger trends, the service implicitly acknowledged that Gettysburg's error was not purely a one-off aberration, but a symptom of deeper stresses across the fleet. The enduring reality of war. When a frontline air defense cruiser mistakes its own Super Hornets for enemy missiles and fires, the result becomes more than a line in an accident database. It becomes a case study in how the pressures of modern combat can compress time, distort perception, and punish even small deviations from procedure with deadly consequences. The Gettysburg shootdown will likely be dissected for years in classrooms, simulators, and wardrooms as officers and sailors study each step of the chain. How the track was classified, how descent failed to surface, how the command decision was framed, to try to ensure that the next crisis ends with missiles launched only at actual enemies. But even as institutions extract lessons and refine doctrine, the incident sits in a long and uncomfortable historical continuum where friendly fire events, from misaimed artillery to misidentified aircraft, have followed armies and navies into every major conflict. In war, with stressed people, imperfect information, and lethal weapons moving at supersonic speeds, these things happen, and the real test for any military is how honestly it faces those failures and how ruthlessly it works to keep them from happening again. Inside the Aegis kill chain. To understand how a U.S. cruiser ended up killing its own jet, the investigation broke down the Aegis kill chain step by step, from detection to engagement, and asked where the system of systems, Humans, sensors, doctrine failed. Modern air defense on a ship like USS Gettysburg depends on a tightly scripted sequence. Radar detects a contact, the combat system forms a track, identification tools and databases shape its classification, and then the command team decides whether to engage. On paper, every link in that chain has guardrails against fratricide. Identification friend or foe, IFF, interrogations, air tasking orders, data link tracks, and voice coordination with the air wing and higher headquarters. The final report made clear that those guardrails existed that night, but they were applied inconsistently. Cross-checks were rushed or incomplete, and the command climate did not generate the forceful internal friction needed to stop a bad engagement from going forward. How the jets appeared as missiles. One of the most disturbing conclusions in the final reporting is how ordinary flight profiles were perceived as lethal inbound weapons. Under the stress of the Houthi missile campaign and earlier real engagements, Gettysburg's watch teams were primed to see fast-moving, inbound tracks as threats first, and to question that perception only if something clearly contradicted it. The investigation and subsequent analyses describe how the F/A-18s approach geometry and speed, viewed in isolation and stripped of proper identification context, fitted a mental model of an incoming missile arc. Instead of starting from the assumption that aircraft in that sector were likely friendly and demanding hard evidence to override that assumption, the watch floor reversed the burden of proof and treated the track as hostile until it could be proved friendly, proof that never came in time. Data links, IFF and missed cues. The strike group had tactical data links and IFF systems that should have reinforced the fighters' friendly status, but the investigation indicates that these tools did not combine into a clear, unambiguous, do-not-shoot picture. In a perfect scenario, the jets, IFF responses, pre-planned flight routes, and network tracks would all line up in the combat system and drive the watch officer to challenge any hostile classification aggressively. Instead, the record points to gaps and inconsistencies, returns that were not properly reconciled, IFF or link information that was either misinterpreted, missing, or overridden by the prevailing threat mindset, and a failure to pause the engagement sequence until the discrepancies were resolved. What emerges is not a single broken box in the ship's electronics, but a pattern of humans not extracting, presenting, and acting on the information their systems could provide. Forceful backup that never came. Forceful backup became one of the key phrases in the investigation's language, a shorthand for the idea that subordinates must actively challenge a developing decision if they see danger or doubt. On Gettysburg, this concept failed at the worst possible moment. Junior and mid-grade watchtenders either did not fully recognize the misidentification or did not push their concerns strongly enough to alter the captain's picture. The final report paints a combat information center in which hierarchical deference and compressed timelines combined to mute dissent. When the engagement recommendation formed around the mistaken conclusion that the tracks were hostile missiles, no one with enough authority and conviction stood in its path and said, "Stop, this does not align with the air plan and identification data." The captain's decision in context. For a ship's commanding officer, authorizing missile fire is one of the heaviest responsibilities in naval warfare, because the order cannot be undone once a standard missile leaves the rail. The investigation judged that the Gettysburg Co.'s decision was not reasonable given the information that should have been available and the standard expected of an Aegis-equipped air defense commander. The report and follow-on coverage stressed that real enemy threats in the theater, including prior Houthi launches, created genuine pressure and a bias toward quick action. However, the final assessment does not allow that context to erase accountability. Instead, it frames the shoot-down as a case where the command team let the threat environment override the discipline of thorough identification, turning legitimate vigilance into catastrophic overreaction. The near-miss second engagement. The fact that a second F/A-18F came within meters of being destroyed gives the incident a chilling, what almost was, dimension. After the first jet was hit, Gettysburg's engagement sequence continued far enough to send another missile toward the second aircraft, which only survived thanks to a combination of evasive maneuvers and the missile's missed distance. Investigative summaries and reporting underline that this was not a single tragic shot but an engagement pattern rolling forward. Had the geometry been slightly different, Or had the crew in the second jet reacted a fraction of a second later or less aggressively, the Navy would have lost 2 aircraft and 4 aviators to its own air defense system in the same brief window of chaos. Strike group culture under strain. The Gettysburg disaster did not happen inside a vacuum. It unfolded within a strike group whose deployment had already been marred by collisions and additional aircraft losses. Investigators tied these mishaps together with themes of rushed workups, degraded maintenance, and a culture that did not consistently enforce standards and questioning attitudes across all units. Within that broader narrative, the cruiser's friendly fire event stands out as the most extreme manifestation of systemic stress. A ship responsible for protecting the carrier ended up threatening it indirectly by eroding confidence in the group's own defensive umbrella. The very architecture designed to shield the air wing had become, for a moment, one of its greatest dangers. Training gaps and simulation shortfalls. One of the clearest institutional lessons in the final material is the need for deeper, more realistic integrated training between surface combatants and carrier air wings before deployment. While individual crews had trained in their own lanes, the Gettysburg investigation concluded that the strike group had not rehearsed complex joint air defense and air operations enough under realistic stress, compressed timelines, and dense air pictures. The Navy highlighted the need to improve both shore-based simulation and at-sea drills that force ships and aircraft to solve identification and engagement problems together, not in isolation. In particular, the service pointed to the importance of practicing ambiguous scenarios, contacts that could be friendly or hostile, so that crews build the muscle memory to slow down, cross-check, and argue constructively before firing. Technical fixes versus human fixes. After any high-profile mishap, there is a temptation to search for quick technical solutions. New software interlocks, additional IFFQs, more automated friend tagging in the combat system. The Gettysburg case did generate discussions about refining how tracks are labeled, how friend identification data is displayed, and how engagement doctrine might force an extra layer of confirmation before firing on certain profiles. Yet the final reporting repeatedly returns to the human dimension. The systems on board were broadly functioning. What failed was the human process of challenging assumptions, reading the full picture, and pushing back when something did not add up. Any technical improvements would matter only if integrated into a culture that values disciplined skepticism as much as decisiveness. Impact on doctrine and procedures. In response, Navy leadership used the investigation to drive updates to doctrine and standing procedures for operations in high-threat, high-density air environments like the Red Sea. These refinements included sharper guidance on when and how to classify ambiguous tracks, how to integrate carrier air wing data into surface ships, decision cycles, and how to ensure that key nodes in the network share the same mental model of the air picture. The service also emphasized renewed training on weapons release authority and the expectation that commanders must err on the side of certainty when friendly aircraft could be inside engagement envelopes. The Gettysburg shootdown thus became an anchor case in internal discussions about how far to push aggressive defense when friendly platforms operate close to threat vectors. The pilot's perspective. For the aircrews involved, the incident forced a brutal reevaluation of risk calculus. Fighter pilots accept danger from enemy missiles, mechanical failure, and carrier operations as part of the job, but being targeted by their own fleet's air defense system sits in a different psychological category. Counts and analyses suggest that, in the aftermath, aviators across the air wing and broader community were forced to ask practical questions. How confident can they be that surface ships are seeing the same picture they are? What additional calls, codes, or flight patterns can they use to reduce misidentification risk when operating near tense surface formations? These questions fed into post-deployment debriefs and recommendations, adding an aircrew voice to the largely surface-driven investigation. Life on Gettysburg after the incident. For sailors on Gettysburg, the deployment did not end with the shootdown. They still had to stand watches, maintain systems, and operate under the gaze of both their own chain of command and a public now aware that the cruiser had shot down a U.S. jet. The internal atmosphere would have been a mix of remorse, defensiveness, and determination to prove reliability through the rest of the cruise. Some sailors carried direct guilt from the consoles they manned. Others likely felt the weight of collective responsibility, knowing that their ship's name would now be attached to one of the most infamous friendly fire cases in recent naval history. The wider fleet takes notice. The shock waves from the Gettysburg incident rippled across the U.S. surface fleet and aviation communities. Other carrier strike groups, destroyer squadrons, and amphibious-ready groups received briefings that walked through the timeline, the missteps, and the conclusions in stark detail, sometimes using red-teamed, "What would you do?" vignettes based on the event. This fleet-wide dissemination served two purposes. It warned other crews that such a failure was possible under modern conditions, and it used Gettysburg as a cautionary tale to reinforce the expectation of aggressive, informed challenge to any engagement decision involving ambiguous tracks. In a sense, the cruiser's worst day became a case study intended to prevent someone else's worst day from ever happening. Media, transparency, and trust. The Navy's decision to publicly release significant details of the incident, including conclusions about leadership failures, represented a calculated choice in balancing embarrassment against credibility. Hiding behind vague statements would have fueled speculation and allowed adversaries' propaganda claims to go unchallenged. Instead, the service accepted short-term reputational damage in order to show that it was willing to confront hard truths. For observers and allies, this level of transparency becomes part of the trust equation. Partners operating alongside U.S. forces in contested waters watch not just how the Navy fights, but how it investigates and corrects itself when it fails, and the Gettysburg Report became an example of that self-critique in action. Historical echoes of friendly fire. Friendly fire incidents have stained almost every major conflict, from World War II bomber streams hit by their own anti-aircraft guns to ground troops shelled by misplotted artillery. In the air domain, misidentification has long haunted fast, ambiguous engagements, including Cold War episodes where fighters, bombers, and even civil aircraft were mistaken for hostile targets under incomplete information. The Gettysburg shootdown fits this historical pattern, but adds a modern twist. A highly networked, sensor-rich force still made the same kind of mistake that earlier generations made with far cruder tools. The lesson is sobering. Better radars, faster networks, and smarter missiles do not automatically prevent fratricide if the human decision architecture around them is brittle. The fine line between aggression and restraint. Modern naval doctrine emphasizes shooting the archer, not the arrow, striking threats as early and decisively as possible. In a theater where Houthi missiles and drones had already menaced shipping, commanders were under quiet pressure to act aggressively rather than risk being too slow. The Gettysburg case exposes the razor-thin boundary between acceptable aggressiveness and reckless misidentification. It demonstrates that real tactical courage may sometimes mean holding fire until identification is truly solid, even when the clock is ticking and every instinct screams to launch. Building that kind of disciplined restraint into doctrine and training is far harder than simply demanding faster trigger pulls. Legacy for future officers. For junior officers and mid-career leaders studying the case in war colleges, fleet training centers, and squadron-ready rooms, the Gettysburg incident is more than a cautionary anecdote. It is a detailed map of where leadership, communication, and culture went wrong under real-world pressure, providing a framework for self-examination. Would I have asked the hard questions? Would my wardroom allow dissent? Would my CIC or ready room challenge me if I were wrong? In this sense, the friendly fire tragedy may shape the thinking of future captains, air wing commanders, and strike group leaders who will one day face their own compressed, high-stakes decisions with incomplete information. If they internalize the case deeply enough, some future misidentification chain may be broken before it reaches the point of no return. The enduring discomfort. Even with reforms, training, and doctrinal changes, the Gettysburg shootdown remains an uncomfortable scar on the record of a technologically advanced Navy. It lives as a reminder that no amount of sophistication can fully erase the core frictions of warfare: fatigue, fear, overconfidence, miscommunication, and the simple human tendency to see what one expects to see. For those who were there, the memory will not fade easily. For the institution, the only acceptable response is to keep folding the story into training, discussion, and culture until its lessons are second nature, until the next watchstander hearing Engage has the knowledge, confidence, and moral courage to say, "No, this picture isn't right." In the end, the Gettysburg incident shows that even in an age of Aegis radars, data links, and smart missiles, war still depends on human judgment, and human judgment will always be fallible. Under stress, under fire, with seconds to decide and lives on the line, men and women will still make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes will shatter friendly machines and endanger friendly crews. But in war, these things happen, and the only way to honor those losses is to study them ruthlessly so they do not happen again.